The European Union will consider fresh sanctions on Russian individuals after more than 3,500 people were arrested across the country for demanding the release of Vladimir Putin's fiercest critic, Alexei Navalny. EU foreign ministers from 27 countries are meeting in Brussels to discuss these sanctions. One of the EU's top diplomats saying that the arrests were of great concern. The group would be discussing its response in the Brussels meeting.
I personally think that a change is in the air in Russia, and this is what makes Mr. Putin so nervous. That's why he detained 3,500 people in the streets. That's why he detained Mr. Navalny. That's why he detained his wife. But I think that the EU needs to send a very clear and decisive message that this is not acceptable. And we have a very, in my opinion, effective mechanism, EU global rights sanctions regime. And I think it needs to be used decisively in order to send a message that human rights abuses, wherever they happen, in Minsk, in Moscow, in Hong Kong, they will not be tolerated.
However, given the current situation, the EU diplomats do not expect to agree on sanctions on Monday. Despite a push from some capitals to take a tough line, Brussels is expected to hold off until Navalny goes to court in early February. The EU wants to see if the Kremlin puts Navalny behind bars for an extended term. The EU already has economic sanctions on the Russian energy, financial and arms sectors. EU has imposed sanctions on Russian officials close to President Vladimir Putin in response to Navalny's poisoning in August. But the Russian president does not seem to be influenced with the growing protests in Russia. Vladimir Putin has called the weekend protests as illegal and dangerous. Fielding questions from the students, he said nobody should use illegal actions to further their own political interests.
Вот все события подобного рода, о которых я сейчас говорил, никто не должен прибегать к ним, стараясь защитить свои какие-то амбициозные задачи и цели, особенно в сфере политики. Так политика не делается, во всяком случае ответственная.
Navalny says Putin was behind his poisoning last August, a version that the Kremlin rejects. The Kremlin, in fact, says it has no evidence that Navalny was poisoned and that it will not heed to calls by some Western countries for sanctions over Navalny's detention because this case is a domestic matter. Police detained more than 3,000 people and used force to break up the rallies across Russia on Saturday. According to reports, over 40,000 people gathered in central Moscow to publicly call for Navalny's release. Ignoring extreme cold conditions, police warnings, Germany and France, the EU's main powers, will be central to deciding if the bloc goes ahead with the punitive measures on Russia. The protests in Russia have been making headlines across the world. More than 3,000 protesters were arrested. They have been demanding the release of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. And now the EU has also indicated that it is looking at fresh sanctions against Russia. Both Germany and France have in fact called for the release of Alexei Navalny as well as the protesters who were arrested. Let's get in a better sense now from our correspondent Trent Murray from Berlin for more on these developments. Hi Trent, what more do we know at this point about these sanctions that are being considered by the European Union, and to what extent will they be a blow to Moscow?
Yeah, well, those European Union foreign ministers have spent most of today behind closed doors meeting to discuss a number of important foreign policy issues, but top of the agenda is the arrest of Alexei Navalny alongside those other 3,000 or so protesters in Russia over the weekend. There are calls, as you mentioned, for the European Union to introduce sanctions against Russian President Vladimir Putin, perhaps some of his inner circle as well as the broader economy. Now, we are still a few steps away from that. any action that strong would need to be signed off by European leaders, people like Chancellor Angela Merkel behind me here in Berlin. But certainly the fact that this discussion is happening is very significant. European foreign ministers watched those arrests over the weekend right across Russia with real horror, just given the sheer number of people that were arrested. And there has been a chorus of condemnation right across the continent over the past 48 hours, especially from countries in the Baltics. The foreign minister from Lithuania said he would like the EU to send a decisive message to Russia and to the Kremlin that this sort of action is not on. The foreign minister of Germany, where I am, he said the rule of law needs to be applied in Russia. So calls that they are hoping the Kremlin will listen to.
Right, but these sanctions, if they do go through, to what extent will they actually be a blow for Moscow? At this point, both Germany and France have called for the release of Alexei Navalny as well as the protesters. What more do we know about the demands that have been made by these countries?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, economic sanctions would be in the area of gas in particular, we suspect would be hit. Of course, there is a very controversial project right now, Nord Stream 2. It's a gas pipeline that will connect Russia to Germany. It will double the amount of gas imports coming into the European continent. Now, that project is already controversial. The European Union has passed a non-binding resolution in the past few days calling for that project to be scrapped. Presumably, any calls for further sanctions would put that project even more in jeopardy. We know the United States is against it. They say it will increase Europe's dependence on Russian gas and therefore give the Kremlin more leverage, particularly in situations like this, like we're seeing with Alexei Navalny. So the sanctions would presumably hit there, as well as I say, the inner circle of Russian President Vladimir Putin. But any decision to go forward with harsh economic sanctions is a decision that the EU will not take lightly. Presumably at European capitals right across the continent tonight, they'll be paying very close attention to what the EU ministers discussed.
All right, Trent Perry, appreciate very much joining us with those details and helping us better understand what things are looking like as far as the EU-Russia ties are concerned. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.